As the veil between the worlds thin, I invite you to join me in celebratory action to create 3 Halloween DIYs that together reveal the Halloween tree. Welcome to our second Halloween episode. Our first little DIY project will be crafting these pumpkin lanterns. We're going to start off by paper macheing a balloon. Now, the first step here is to make sure that our balloon is a little bit more pumpkin shaped. And we're going to do this by twisting wire around a balloon. I make sure that this balloon isn't fully puffed up with air. And my main priority at this point is to make sure that I don't accidentally puncture the balloon. And so I'm very gingerly taking wire and creating different twists at the top, manipulating the balloon inside to make sure that things are pretty evenly spaced to create a pumpkin shape. I also give it a light squeeze to help flatten it a bit to accentuate that pumpkin figure. Now, with a mix of equal parts flour and water, which is just my go-to paper mache mix, it's very easy and pretty foolproof in my opinion, I'm taking some torn tissue paper and applying very thin layers all around the balloon. Now, making sure that all of the joints are connected with tissue paper in between. I don't want to have any bald spots, and for this reason I would highly recommend using a balloon that's a big contrast in color from the tissue paper so you can see if there's any thin areas. So for example, the blue I was using is a horrible choice. The red contrasting the white would have been a lot better. Now I am taking some orange paint. I am making it a little bit more dull with a little bit of brown and doing a very, very light coat after the paper mache has dried, which takes, I would say, about a day. It depends on the humidity levels and your environment. It could vary, but I would always lean on the side of caution because since this is paper mache with tissue paper, it is quite thin. And wet paint is obviously going to wet it again. So you want to make sure that your paint is very, very thin and that things are fully dry. I also do recommend leaving the balloon in as you paint to minimize any warping of potentially softened paper mache. If you do have any dents that come out once you have popped your balloon, it is very easy to just stick your hand in and punch it back. To also help this issue, I make sure to make the smallest hole in my balloon and give it all the time that it needs to deflate so that it doesn't accidentally collapse in on itself. And even though this is made with tissue paper, I do recommend doing quite a few layers to make sure that it is thick enough that it isn't a pain to work with. Now, after I've clipped out the wires and created a hole, I can add my votive candles. I do recommend using votive candles or any kind of tea light candles that are fake, obviously, but also are remote controlled because we are going to be wrapping these in a light tulle fabric, and it's very easily to undo it and change the battery if you need to, but just to minimize how often you have to do that, hopefully just once per season. If you have a remote control, it allows you to turn off the votives and not have a whole mess. You can find tulle fabric pre-cut very cheaply at craft stores or Walmart, and I feel like it accentuates the curves of the pumpkin and adds a hauntingly beautiful appearance. The first step here is to collect some maple leaves from your yard or your local park. If you're not able to do that, you can go online, Pinterest, Google a maple leaf and just get a basic shape. I'm going to press my leaves very briefly, like 30 minutes or so, just enough to make sure that they're flat enough to trace. It doesn't have to be fully dry or anything. Now we're going to be creating a template where we're going to be having 3 size blocks for each maple leaf of whatever size that you need. We're going to have 1 large block, which is going to be that middle section of the maple leaf, 2 medium blocks, and 2 small blocks. And we're going to be doing the math. So yes, class is in session. We're going to be doing a little bit of math to calculate how big to make each of these blocks so that we can have the proper template for our leaves. We're going to start off by having the central point at the very bottom and extending a line at every topmost and lowermost portion of each leaf. And this is going to help segment into these different sections. So again, 1 large section, 2 medium, and 2 small. Now we're going to be taking a line and creating a kind of triangle-ish shape where we're connecting the topmost points and lowestmost points for each of these sections and taking their measurements. And I take the measurements for the leaf all around just so I can get the biggest measurement to make sure that my template is big enough and I don't accidentally have any issues. Now once you have this number, you're going to add 3/8 of an inch to it. And this is because we're going to be doing quite a bit of overlapping and gluing, and this gives us that cushion for that. We're going to take that number that we calculated and create 3 lines, and this is going to be the width. Now I'm going to be creating almost a right angle by just drawing a line, not almost right angle, a right angle, and creating a line all the way to infinity. It doesn't really matter. And taking that length of each of the section from the base point all the way to the topmost point of each of those large, medium, small sections, and you're going to be lining it up with the bottom width point and then just seeing where it hits on that line that we drew. And that's going to help us create a rectangle. I'm just cutting that rectangle in half just to show how it should look. So we're going to be cutting out these rectangles and then cutting each of those rectangles on the diagonal and gluing them together, and that's going to give us all those sections. Now I go ahead, since I had all my lines, and I am just cutting up that template that I drew to give me, again, all those sections. And you're going to use some heavy crepe paper. It has a little bit of stretch. Don't stretch it, just leave it the way it is. But it's a little bit more sturdy than the stuff that you used in elementary school. After cutting each of these blocks on the diagonal again, you're going to be taking a very thin piece of wire. I used 24 gauge. I tried some thicker and it was just not very fun. And you use a little bit of tacky glue and overlap. So again, this is what the 3/8 of an inch is about. This is the first overlap that we're going to be doing. Now I'm starting off with my middle large section, and I actually found that using little clips helps to keep things in place because this is really small. These things are really, really tiny, and you move it just even a little bit and it's completely off. And you can use hair clips, I'm sure, anything that you have around the house, and get creative. And now it's just a matter of cutting out each of these sections and gluing them one to another. So here again is the other 1/8 of an inch, and then the other side is going to be another 1/8 of an inch. So that's how all the math works out. Hopefully I explained that sort of decently. After you have all of your sections glued together, twist all of the wires that you have. Any little spare piece of crepe paper, since it is stretchy, like I said, if you cut it on the horizontal, you get a really thin line and you're able to wrap that around to create a stem. And finally, we have arrived at our Halloween tree. If you've made it up to this point, leave me a pumpkin emoji. Now, the very first step here is to create our base for our tree. And I'm going to be using cardboard to make all of this because, as you all know, unless you're new to this channel, I am a huge lover and fanatic of cardboard. I'm a cardboard hoarder. I am very proudly someone who saves everything because I feel like there's a use for everything. I'm starting off by lining up where I want this cardboard to be and creating a sort of semicircle shape. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is all going to be covered, but this is just something for us to build our tree off of. The next thing I'm going to do here is cutting different strips of paper. I want them to be big enough so that my life isn't super tedious, but also small enough to help make this more of a curved shape. I'm using a glue gun to just glue a ton of glue to the base and adhere these strips to. And then I'm going to go and connect each of these strips with some more glue on both the front and the back. I want this to be as strong as possible, and I'll get more into reinforcements later. Now for this next tier, because again, we're just building tiers one on top of the other, we're going to repeat that process, but we're going to make sure that these strips are now staggered so they're on the last strip's joints, if that makes sense. One tip that I have for this that I discovered partway through this project is that this eats through glue sticks for your glue gun. And I just have this tiny little $3 glue gun from, I don't know, Walmart. So it's not one of those big heavy duty ones, and I was having to refill it all the time. So I actually ended up buying 8-inch long sticks, and that I highly recommend it. I highly probably recommend a larger glue gun to begin with, but get the biggest sticks you can so that you're not having to drive yourself crazy having to refill it. Now, after I've made several tiers, I'm going to start mapping out where I want the branches to be. And just as with my houses that I make out of cardboard and everything, I'm very whimsical. I'm not very calculated with any of this project because I'm trying to see how things look. I rip things out when I don't like it. I feel like cardboard is just very flexible. If it doesn't work, you're not married to it. And so it's just a lot of testing and feeling, and there were full-on branches that I just ripped off because I didn't like where they were, and it's totally fine. One thing I just showed a little bit, and I did a lot more than what I showed on camera, is adding proper reinforcements. We're going to be paper macheing this, and that is going to add weight, and obviously the branches are going to add weight to it, and we want to make sure that things are as sturdy as possible. So I actually glued together several layers of cardboard to make really thick blocks and reinforced the very back of this tree very heavily. I also added a 10-pound weight because I have plenty of those around my house, and that just helps to stabilize the tree as a whole so it's not leaning over as the branches start to add more weight to it. Now that we have our basic shape, we're going to be using some of this butcher paper that I've been saving for who knows how long, that you get in like packages from the mail. I figured that they would do really well for not only the paper mache, but also creating these little root systems. Again, there's no method to this madness really. I'm just clumping pieces of paper together, using masking tape to bind it, and just contorting it in whichever way I want it to look, and making sure that I bulk it up enough so it doesn't look scraggly. Now with the paper mache, I'm using the same ratios of mix as before with the pumpkins, and I'm taking some of this butcher paper and I'm heavily crinkling it, especially vertically, if that makes sense. And I'm adding a layer of paper mache to the base of the cardboard, adding the paper on top, and then continuing to add more paper mache over the top of it. I am trying to preserve as many crinkles as possible because this is what's going to give it that tree look. But I did find that especially the higher up I got, the more I ended up working with the paper mache bed and creating crinkles by hand. Now for each of the edges, you want to make sure that you have about like an inch tail so that you can add some more of your paper mache paste to the back and kind of fold over the edges of the paper to create a really smooth edge. The very first coat of paint that I'm doing is a dark coat to help create depth, because this is going to be trapped in all of the little crevices. I used a nearly black, not fully black, but nearly black brown areas that I felt were farther away from light and also had more texture, and then a slightly lighter brown in any of the highermost points, the points that I feel like light would hit it, to add just a little bit of extra dimension to it. After that had dried, I am stippling on some more brown to create more of that rougher texture, and then dry brushing with light browns and whites to really hit the high points, especially after we've already darkened everything, and bring out all those crinkles from the paper. Now, in truth, this wasn't one of my favorite projects, and I just wanted to verbalize that because I think it's okay to create things and not be in love with it. And I think it's still fun to have that process and to have things that you learn from everything that you do. And I'm thinking I might rework this a little bit next year, so stick around and see if what I might come up with. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please comment down below which DIY is your favorite or which DIY you would like to try. If you would like to support my channel any further, I do have a Ko-fi link down in my description box, and you can send me a little tip and all funds will go towards creating these projects for you all. I have more stuff coming for this Halloween season, so stick around and I will see you in the next video. Enjoy the reveal.